Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world when watching this webcast. Welcome to the first of the three webcasts on the Exposure Draft Subsidiaries without Public Accountability Disclosures. The Exposure Draft was published by the Board in July 2021 and sets out the proposal for a new IFRS standard that would permit eligible subsidiaries to apply reduced disclosure requirements when applying IFRS standards. I am Carlo Pereras, ISB Technical Staff and Project Lead. I am joined here today by another member of the project team, ISB Technical Staff, Hazira Hasni. In this webcast, we will be discussing the objective and scope of the exposure draft. Parts 2 and 3 of this series of webcasts will cover how the disclosure requirements were developed and the structure and application of the draft IFRS standard. We hope the webcast would be helpful. With that, Hazira, can you walk us through the objective and scope of this exposure draft?
My pleasure, Carlo. To understand the objective of the exposure draft, let us first take a look at why the board published the exposure draft. The board developed the exposure draft following stakeholders' feedback on the 2015 agenda consultation. Some preparers said that although subsidiaries reporting to them for consolidation purposes could prepare their financial statements applying IFRS standards and therefore base their financial statements on their reporting pack, the disclosures required by IFRS standards are not designed for the needs of subsidiaries' financial statements. Consequently, preparing subsidiary financial statements applying IFRS standard could be costly and outweigh the information needs of its users. On the other hand, if subsidiaries prepare their financial statements applying IFRS for SME standard or local GAAP, they would still need to provide IFRS standards-based accounts for their parents' consolidated financial statements. Although they might be able to give fewer disclosures, the subsidiaries may need to keep additional accounting records because recognition and measurement requirements could be different from IFRS standards. In summary, these preparers considered the cost of financial reporting for subsidiaries to be high. If IFRS standards are applied, the subsidiary would have to consider the cost of preparing disclosures intended for publicly accountable entities, or if IFRS for SME standard or local GAAP is applied, the subsidiary would have to consider the cost of reconciling recognition and measurement differences with its parent that applies IFRS standard. The board's proposed solution is to develop a new IFRS standard that permits eligible subsidiaries to apply the recognition, measurement, and presentation requirements in IFRS standards, but with reduced disclosure requirements. This way, subsidiaries can use recognition and measurement requirements consistent with those used by their parent companies, while providing reduced disclosures consistent with their users' needs. The proposed IFRS standard is also optional, which means subsidiaries can elect and are not compelled to apply this standard. The objective of the exposure draft is to permit eligible subsidiaries to apply the disclosure requirements of the draft standard and recognition, measurement, and presentation requirements in IFRS standards. The objective aims to simplify and reduce costs of financial reporting for subsidiaries while maintaining the usefulness of their financial statement for its users. Now that we have explained the objective of the exposure draft, let us consider the benefits of the board's proposals. As noted, the proposal would reduce costs for preparers. If a subsidiary previously applied local GAAP in preparing its financial statements, it could, where appropriate, align accounting policies with that of their parents, which could avoid the need to maintain another set of accounting records. Or, if they are already applying IFRS standards, reduced disclosures could translate to reduced work for the accounting team. Further, although the draft IFRS standard has fewer disclosures compared to those required in IFRS standards, usefulness of the financial statements is maintained. This is because the approach applied by the board in developing the disclosures considered the nature of these eligible subsidiaries. The disclosures that the eligible subsidiary would be required to provide are those that are intended to meet their users' information needs. As I mentioned earlier, the draft IFRS standard would be an optional IFRS standard. This would mean, before electing to apply the standard, a subsidiary would satisfy itself that the benefits of applying the standard outweigh any cost. Moving on, let's talk about who these eligible subsidiaries are who could apply the draft IFRS standard. The proposed IFRS standard can be applied by an entity that is a subsidiary at the end of its reporting period. The subsidiary can apply the standard in its consolidated, separate, or individual financial statements provided it meets the following criteria. First, the subsidiary does not have public accountability. And second, the subsidiary has a parent, whether ultimate or intermediate, that produces consolidated financial statements available for public use that comply with IFRS standards. Now, these two criteria are not new. The first criteria, public accountability, is based on the description in the IFRS for SMEs standard. That standard explains that a company is publicly accountable if its debt or equity instruments are traded in a public market, or it holds assets in a fiduciary capacity as one of its primary businesses. The second criteria, a parent producing consolidated financial statements that comply with IFRS standards, is based on paragraph 4A4 of IFRS 10. To illustrate the scope of the proposed IFRS standard, let us consider some scenarios. In the first scenario, the parent produces consolidated financial statements complying with IFRS standards, and the subsidiary is not publicly accountable. So, is the subsidiary eligible to apply the proposed standard? Yes, this is because the subsidiary meets the eligibility criteria. The subsidiary is not publicly accountable and has a parent that produces consolidated financial statement complying with IFRS standards. In the second scenario, the parent prepares consolidated financial statement applying a local GAAP, and the subsidiary is not publicly accountable. Is the subsidiary eligible to apply the proposed standard? No. Although the subsidiary does not have public accountability, it will not be eligible to apply the proposed standard because its parent does not produce consolidated financial statement complying with IFRS standards. In other words, it fails to meet one of the eligibility criteria. In the third and final scenario, again, the subsidiary does not have public accountability here, but it has an ultimate and an intermediate parent. In this scenario, only the intermediate parent produces consolidated financial statements complying with IFRS standards. So, is the subsidiary eligible to apply the proposed standard? Yes. Despite its ultimate parent not preparing consolidated financial statements, the subsidiary is still eligible to apply the proposed standard. This is because it does not have public accountability and it has a parent that produces consolidated financial statement complying with IFRS standards, which is its intermediate parent. As said earlier, the eligibility criteria requires subsidiary to have either an ultimate or intermediate parent that complies with IFRS standard in its consolidated financial statements. Having an intermediate parent that prepares consolidated financial statement complying with IFRS standards would permit the subsidiary to apply the proposed standard. And with that, we have now come to the end of our webcast on objective and scope. Let me hand over back to Carlo.
Great! Thank you, Azira. The exposure draft is open for comment until 31st of January 2022. For more information about the project, or if you want to submit a comment letter, please visit the project page on www.ifrs.org. As part of this webcast series, we also have webcasts on the following topics: how disclosure requirements were developed, and the structure and application of the draft IFRS standard. Thank you everyone for listening to this webcast and for your interest in this project. See you at the next webcast.